I want to start, and I hope I'm not repeating anything that's already been said, but I think it's always useful for us to start these conversations with a reminder of the stakes. And as I'm sure a lot of you know, at the moment in Egypt, the UN's convening its annual climate talks. And in the run-up to those talks, every year there are a series of reports that are published precisely to remind us of the stakes, how far we need to go and where we are relative to that. So in the last week, we've heard from the World Meteorological Organization that the last 8 years have been the 8 hottest years on record. We've heard that to stay within internationally agreed goal of what is considered to be a threshold for a safe climate, although that's contestable. I think a lot of people would agree that we've already passed that threshold, but that 1.5 degree threshold requires us to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions by 45% by 2030. At this point in time, our trajectory is to reduce emissions by 1%. And then I think the other thing that we need to keep in mind that's especially salient in a year when we are talking about energy security and oil and gas production, largely as a result of Russia's war against Ukraine, is how much fossil fuel we can burn if we're going to stay within that 1.5 degree guardrail. And according to the UN's Environment Programme, at the moment, the world is on track to produce twice the volume of fossil fuels of oil, gas and coal that we can burn by 2030 if we are going to stay within that limit. And I think the UN Secretary General, who's actually surprisingly provocative when he speaks about fossil fuels, but he recently said something to the effect of climate activists aren't the dangerous radicals. The dangerous radicals are the countries that are currently seeking to expand fossil fuel production. And so that, I think, brings me to why I founded Uplift and why I'm here today. And that is that the UK is currently the second largest oil and gas producer in Europe. We, as a country, have a legal duty, the government has a legal duty to maximise economic recovery of offshore oil and gas, which is 95% of our country's oil and gas reserves. And whether or not something is economically recoverable is significantly skewed by the fact that we give enormous subsidies to oil and gas companies in the North Sea as a result of the way that the tax regime operates, and that means that the UK is currently the most profitable country in the world for large oil and gas projects, which I think is shocking to a lot of people, but less shocking when you learn that because of the operation of the tax regime, for example, in 2020, the UK was the only country in the world in which Shell operates in which it didn't pay any tax. So in Norway, it paid more than £1.5 billion in tax. In the UK, the taxpayer gave Shell about £100 million in rebates. So the operation of the tax regime has happily become a matter of public concern this year because of the eye-watering profits that oil and gas companies are making as a result largely of the spike in global gas prices caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And there's rightly been a call for the government to recoup some of those enormous profits that are purely windfall and that they're not investing anything further to get them out of the ground. They're just in the right place at the right time. So there's been a windfall tax introduced that does increase to some extent the tax rate on oil and gas companies, but we're still below the global average tax rate for the oil and gas industry. I'm not going to talk much more about tax because I suspect that's not why you're here this evening. But what I will say is that the reason actually, I mean, I think Greg did a brilliant job of outlining, and of course people are living with the enormous amount of anxiety that we are all facing because of the cost of our energy bills. But the UK has the highest household energy bills of any European country. And that's because we are exceptionally dependent on gas. 85% of our homes are heated by gas, and gas is about 40% of our electricity generation. And our dependency on gas is very much connected to the fact that we've had this massive domestic oil and gas industry that in the early 70s led to everybody's house being connected to the gas network. And that's why we are here today. So aside from all of the other imperatives for us to stop burning fossil fuels, the political and economic power of the oil and gas industry is part of the reason why 7 million households are expected to be in fuel poverty this winter, even with the £60 billion support package that the government's put in place to cap the unit price of energy. So I would like to say a bit concretely, because I realise that that's all quite bad news. I've got one more bit of bad news before the good news. And that is that at the moment, I think in many ways, the lunacy of the UK government's approach to energy is captured by a single oil field that is due for approval imminently in the North Sea, and that is the Rosebank oil field. Rosebank is an oil field that is 3 times the size of Cambo, which many of you may have heard about last year, a highly controversial oil field. Uplift coordinated the campaign against it, and it was subsequently paused. But if you were to burn all of the oil in Rosebank, it would create emissions that are equivalent to the 28 lowest income countries, or the emissions of 700 million poor people in the world. It is also a field that will produce 90% oil, 80% of which we as a country export, because we don't have the refinery capacity to use it here. So it is not being used to fill your cars or meet domestic energy demand in any way. It's being used to really enrich the oil and gas companies that are the license holders for that field. The other things that you should know about Rosebank are that as a result of the operation of the tax regime, Equinor, which is the lead operating company, will receive a £500 million subsidy from the UK government to run that field. And Equinor is owned by the Norwegian state, which, as you probably know, is one of the richest countries in the world. They have $1 trillion sovereign wealth fund that they've made from extracting oil and gas in their part of the world. And the final thing I'll say about Rosebank is that the gas pipeline that is going to run from the field overlaps with a marine protected area in the North Atlantic west of the Shetlands. So it is an environmental, climate and financial disaster. And I think it is exactly the kind of fight that we need to have right now to demonstrate not only that, all of the evidence as to how good the alternatives, that wind and solar power in the UK currently are 9 times cheaper than gas to generate electricity from, but also that continuing to lock in infrastructure like Rosebank, which could operate until 2051, is pushing us in exactly the wrong direction for our energy security, energy affordability, and of course, climate security. So we are coordinating a campaign against the Rosebank oil field. I strongly encourage you to join us. It doesn't involve you necessarily dangling off a bridge on the M25 if that's not your cup of tea. That's not how Uplift works. There are a lot of different things that you can do to get involved. Rosebank.org.uk is the place to go to find out more. And the last thing that I'll briefly say, I'm conscious that I've probably already overrun my time, is to mention the campaign that Chris mentioned at the outset, which is called Warm This Winter. And so the genesis of Warm This Winter as a campaign was really the realisation that I think Greg articulated so beautifully, which is that at the start of the year, we had 3 crises: war, energy unaffordability, and climate change, all of which are being driven by our dependency on fossil fuels, and that we have a fundamentally broken energy system. And in the UK, people are going to feel that much more acutely than they've felt it for decades, because, as I said, millions of people, 7 million people, households in fuel poverty this winter, when the government's energy price cap support runs out in April, that number jumps to 11 million households, which is almost 1 in 4 in the UK. And Oxford certainly isn't exempt from that. So we have come together with campaigners who work on fuel poverty, as well as poverty more generally, disability rights, really everyone, because everyone has something at stake as a result of how dysfunctional our energy system is. And we are calling on the government to do 4 things. The first is to make sure that everyone has the financial support that they need to be able to keep their heating on this winter, and that no one falls through the gap. It's not acceptable that in a country with the 6th biggest economy in the world, that 7 million households may have to choose between feeding their families and turning on their heating. The second thing we're calling for is a massive national drive to upgrade our homes and insulate our homes. And that's a campaign that Friends of the Earth, England, Wales and Northern Ireland are really leading on, because the UK also has the leakiest, dampest homes of any Western European country. 1 in every £4 you spend on your heating goes throughout the doors, the windows and the ceilings. The third thing we're calling on the government to do is to completely unblock renewable energy resources in this country. So we've had this insane situation where there is effectively a moratorium on onshore wind and solar in the UK, despite, as I said, the fact that those are sources of energy that are 9 times cheaper than gas, and they're popular, by the way. All of the polling shows that, you know, the fear that people don't want wind and solar in their backyard just isn't the case, especially when you explain to them what the financial and environmental benefits are. And the fourth thing we're calling on the government to do is to end our dependency on oil and gas by no longer opening up new oil and gas fields, whether that's fracking onshore in the English countryside or massive dirty new oil fields that are enriching foreign oil and gas companies in the North Sea and North Atlantic. So those are the things. That's also got a very simple, I hope, website to remember, warmthiswinter.org.uk. There's a day of action that's being planned on the 3rd of December. We've had a huge amount of interest and engagement from constituencies around the country in getting involved. And I think, you know, what we need right now is a very clear and simple message about what we need to do to make sure not only that we're warm this winter, but also in the winters to come. Because for as long as we're dependent on volatile global gas prices, we are really beholden to murderous dictators and other forces that are completely out of our control, and it just doesn't have to be that way. I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.